Hey, I'm Srini, host and founder of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast and the creator of Maximize Your Output with Mem. And in this video, which is part 3 of our series on best practices for capturing, organizing, and using your notes, we're going to talk about how to use your notes. And if you haven't checked it out, be sure to check out our free ultimate guide to building a second brain in Mem. I'll include a link in the description below. Now, let's get to the video.
In the previous 2 videos, we talked about best practices for capturing and organizing your notes. And in this video, I want to talk about some best practices for using your notes. And what you'll notice is that there's going to be a lot of overlap between what we talked about in the previous 2 videos and this one, and that is very much by design. The thing about making your notes usable is to make them more usable. And it takes us back to some of the principles we talked about in the previous 2 videos. The first, of course, is titles. As I've emphasized throughout this entire series, titles are vitally important because they make it easier to find things. They make it easier to connect notes to other notes. As you'll notice right here from this outline, this is all made from notes that were already inside of the database, and I'm able to do that because of the titles. But if we want to drill down even deeper and make our notes more useful, we need to do more than just give them good titles. We need to write good notes. And there are a couple of ways to do that. The first is by distilling something down to its essence using progressive summarization, which is a method from Tiago Forte's book. So here is an example of progressive summarization done properly. And you can see here that I can go into this set of book notes and I can find the most important points. And for example, I interviewed the author of this book. So when I wanted to ask her questions about specific things, I already had quotes to reference during our conversation because I had broken this up into different sections and gone through and bolded the different things that were important to me. Now, one thing I say frequently is that collecting quotes leads to useless notes. What do I mean by that? Let's look at an example of a set of book notes that I didn't progressively summarize. This is just a giant blob of text. Now, I might want to be able to go back and reference this book at some point, but if I wanted to use something from this book, I'd have to sift through this and it would take a long time to see if there's anything useful. Now, contrast that with this note from that same book, which is a literature note. And you can see here that one, it has a title that makes sense. I have rewritten it in my own words and I have a reference to the original source. And in my mind, the mark of a good title is that you can get the gist of the note without even reading the note. So that's the thing that you need to keep in mind when it comes to titles. So now that we've talked about how to make your notes more usable, let's talk about how to actually use them. So the first example I want to go over is something very simple, which is research. Let's say, for example, that you are writing an article about AI. And you can see here that I have the tag artificial intelligence, and the moment that I put the tag artificial intelligence, any of the notes that I have with that same tag would show up on the sidebar. And that way I can just start to add links to them. So I could say, okay, you know what, I'm going to just create a page with all notes related to AI, and they're all going to be on this one page. It'll just be a topic page for my own research. And the nice thing is that we're able to retrieve this knowledge with no friction inside of Mem. So that's one example of how we might use our notes. The other is resource curation is similar to research, but in this case, I'm talking about huge categories. So for example, if I click on the tag UC transcript, you can see here that I have all the various podcast transcripts that I've imported from my interviews on the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. And in this case, it doesn't really make sense to create a single page with links to all these transcripts because there's so many of them. So tags tend to be a much more useful way of doing this. And I just usually tag it with the name of the podcast guest. But another example is something like books. Now, you can see here, again, books are similar to my transcripts because of the fact that I have so many of them. But let's say, for example, that I wanted to do something like put together a top 10 list, which is something that I do every year for the books that I've read. And so rather than having to decide at the end of the year, throughout the year, I basically just add this tag. So that way, when I want to write the blog post for the top 10 books, all I have to do is go ahead and click on the top 10 books of 2022. And then what I can do is just curate them into a blog post really quickly. As you'll see here, that's exactly what I did. So that way, rather than having to spend, say, maybe 5-6 hours trying to find all this stuff, I spend maybe 5 or 6 minutes finding all this stuff and then end up just writing my own description of it and why I like the book so much. But let's look at a more detailed example, and that is something like writing. Now, writing in Mem is very different than it is in other tools because of the fact that you're not just going to sit down and write in these huge sort of bursts, but you can take this sort of atomic approach to writing. So one of the things we're going to look at is an example of planning a blog post. Now, what you'll notice here is that I basically put together all of these different links, and then I just used Mem Spotlight to bring each of these notes into here. So another thing I could do is I could say, okay, what other notes do I have here that might be somewhat useful for this? So let's say that I wanted to add some other notes using Mem Spotlight. The other thing I could do is I could say, okay, you know what? I want to talk about how to make your notes discoverable in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in this note. And you can see here that what we're doing basically is we're basically putting together a puzzle, and each of our notes are pieces of that puzzle. And that's the cool thing about Mem, is that we don't have to write in these big sort of marathon writing sessions. We can write notes that are maybe 3-4 sentences. And if we did 5 or 6 of those every day, eventually they start to add up and you get the compound interest effect of taking smart notes. And again, what you'll notice here is that the titles are vitally important to this. The thing about almost all of these titles is that I know what these titles are about without even necessarily having to drill down into the notes. So I can actually use these notes in different blog posts and link them together in sentences. And you can see here, even within the notes, there are multiple links where, because of the way I've titled the notes, I'm able to combine them together into sentences. There are a couple different ways you want to think about using your notes when it comes to combining them. One is doing exactly what we're doing here, which is combining them all into a blog post. But then you can see here, even within those notes, we've embedded links inside of sentences, making each of our notes more usable than they would be if they were just a blob or a block of text without any real context. So let's look at one final example, and that is going to be planning a project. So the nice thing about planning projects in Mem is that it allows you to gather all your resources in one place and put everything together very quickly. And one thing I know right now is that I'm going to be teaching a webinar for the Mem team on Smart Write and Edit, and I have a meeting with Alex from Mem today. What I need to do is I need to put together an outline. So what am I going to do? I'm going to see what information I already have. Now, this actually is a bad example of a title. Even though it has great content in it, I wouldn't necessarily know what the content of this note is if I were to say, look back at this sometime in the future, because Meminar is just vague. I might remember say, hey, I taught a Meminar, but if I didn't actually know what Meminar meant or something like that, it wouldn't be very useful. So ideally, another thing you want to think about is how could I title this so that somebody who knows nothing about my database could find whatever it is they're looking for. But I know that I have a couple of different notes on content aware AI. I also have the AI second brain, and I have this promo blog post that I wrote for my new book, which might have some ideas in it. And so what you can see here is that what we're doing is we're just starting to gather different notes that I might be able to use in the process of putting together my slides for this webinar. And then what we can do is we can take all of these different notes and we can basically create a sequence of action steps and tasks based on those notes. And effectively, in just a few minutes, we've planned a project using our notes. So let's go back to the outline and just recap everything that we've talked about here. So the most important thing, if you want to be able to use your notes, is, as ridiculous as it sounds, to make them usable. And that means giving every note a title, distilling the content of that note down to its essence so that you could look at that note and get the gist of it, writing smart notes, rewriting them in your own words so you can combine them into different blocks and treating them as different puzzle pieces. We can use our notes for research. We might want to research a particular topic. We can use titles and tags and bidirectional links to say, okay, give me all my notes on artificial intelligence and put them all together in one note. We can curate resources like books, for example, or transcripts, or maybe you have notes from a course. So you can see here that I have a mem titled Course Materials, Maximize Your Output, which is basically links to all of the module outlines for the Maximize Your Output with Mem course. And finally, with writing, what we can do is we can embed links to other notes and sentences, use Mem Spotlight to combine things together and build an archipelago of ideas. And in many ways, we repeat that same process when it comes to project planning. Now, one thing that I've said throughout this series is that it seems like there's probably a lot of overlap between the content in all three videos, and that's because of the fact that knowledge generation in a network is circular. You're going to capture notes, you're going to organize notes, you're going to distill them, and you're going to probably do a lot of this simultaneously, which is very different than the way that we're used to capturing knowledge and organizing information. But once you start to see the value of all these sort of small atomic units and the fact that they're like puzzle pieces, but the cool thing is that just because you use those pieces in one puzzle, it doesn't mean you can't use them in another. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below.